Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, Dr. Karl Kurtz of the National Conference of State Legislatures discusses the political effects of term limits on the 15 state legislatures that have enacted them, and whether or not term limits would create a better state government in Illinois. This runs about 35 minutes.
It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today, coming from Denver, Colorado, the headquarters of the National Conference of State Legislatures. NCSL is a national organization of all of the 7,383 state legislators in the United States and their roughly 25,000 staff people. And a lot of people ask, well, what does your organization do? And the best answer I can give to that is we do exactly what we're doing here. Hundreds of times a day our phone rings or we get an email message saying, I want to introduce a bill in my state to do X. What's the experience of other states with similar legislation? Well, X in this instance happens to be term limits. And we do know something about that as a result of a national study that we did, and that's what I'm here to share with you today. Let me say at the outset, I don't normally favor a gangster look, but I opened up my bag this morning and discovered that I had failed to pack a shirt. And so I'm wearing the same shirt that I wore on the airplane here yesterday. So apologies for my informality. So, term limits. There are 15 states today that have term limits. At one point, there were 21. Between 1990 and 2000, 21 of the 24 states that have the initiative enacted term limits, almost the entire universe. The three that did not, in two of them they were defeated, in Mississippi and North Dakota, and in one, Illinois, it was ruled off the ballot, not allowed to be on the ballot by the Supreme Court, and you'll be hearing much more about that as the day goes on. So virtually the entire universe of states with the initiative enacted them. In six of those states, the term limit measures were repealed in 4 instances by the state courts, ruling them invalid based on state constitutional provisions, and in 2 instances where the term limits had been enacted by statute, the legislature repealed them before they went into effect. That was in Utah and in Idaho. In Idaho, there was an outcry against the legislature repealing those term limits, so there was a referendum placed on the ballot to invalidate what the legislature had done, and the voters rejected that. In other words, they upheld the legislature's decision to repeal term limits. So let's see. Oh, there's my, thought I did not have this. Okay, so these are the 15 states with term limits, and there are 2 key variables here when you look at the types of term limits. One is the length of the limit, and the other is whether the limit is a consecutive limit or a lifetime limit. A lifetime limit is one where once you've served your designated period of time, you can never come back to the legislature. The consecutive limits, on the other hand, it varies from state to state, but after a certain period of time of sitting out, 2 years, 4 years, it varies, you can come back to the legislature. So you can see here that the most common type of term limit among the 50 states is 8 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate. The most common form is the 8-year House, 8-year Senate consecutive limit. The key point about this slide, though, is that the type of term limit makes a big difference in terms of its impact. And if you look at the upper right corner of this slide, the Arkansas and Michigan have the most restrictive term limits, with 6 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate, and they are lifetime limits. And so just think for a minute, if you have a 6-year term limit in the House, then you by definition have a Speaker of the House, a chairman of your chairperson of your Appropriation Committee, or the key positions in the legislature are occupied by people who have a maximum of 4 years of experience in their last term of office. Contrast that with Louisiana down here in the category of 12 years in the House and 12 years in the Senate, and it's a consecutive limit. That's almost not a limit at all, because most legislators don't serve more than 12 years. Yes, a few do, and that increases the average, but the great majority of legislators don't spend more than 8 or 10 years in the legislature. So the point here is that the type of term limit makes a big difference. So these term limits were enacted between 1990 and 2000. They started in Oklahoma, followed a few months later by California and Colorado in November of 1990. This was the result of something of a national movement. It was a conservative-inspired movement as and in reaction to a strong sense of distrust. It was also, quite frankly, a Republican strategy. Remember that initially the term limits were aimed at Congress, and frustration with the Congress that was at that time dominated and had been for many years by Democrats. But the aim at Congress misfired in effect when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that states could not limit the terms of members of Congress. But that inspired the notion to continue on that, well, maybe if it were good for Congress, it would be good for state legislatures as well. And I think state legislatures were caught up in a lot of frustration with government at the national and federal level. So after these term limits were imposed and it had a few years of experience, we at NCSL determined that it would be very useful to do a national study of the impact of term limits. And we did that in conjunction with two other organizations, the Council of State Governments and the State Legislative Leaders Foundation, and a group of about a dozen political scientists from throughout the country, one of whom was Chris Mooney from here in Illinois, whom you'll hear from later on. In this study, we gathered a lot of aggregate data. I'm going to share some of that with you. We did a survey of all state legislators in the nation, which then allowed us to compare the attitudes, the approaches, the systems of legislatures in term-limited states to the ones in non-term limited states. And then we also did more intensive case studies of 9 states. 6 of them were term-limited states, and you'll see which ones they were in a moment. And 3 of them were non-term limited states because we wanted some kind of control. We wanted to make sure that whatever changes we were observing in the term limited states were due to term limits and not to some other factors. And actually one of the 3 control states, non-term limited states that we looked at was Illinois. And Chris Mooney was the leader of that Illinois case study. So let's just get to some of this data. Here you see a slide that shows the turnover of the membership of legislatures. The upper one that's in blue that maybe you can't distinguish from the back of the room is the upper one when you get to the right-hand side is the term-limited states showing rates of 35–40% turnover being routine in the term-limited states, and the non-term limited states there in the dotted red line much lower, 15 or 20% difference after term limits were imposed. So when you look at this slide, you can see over on the left-hand side, before term limits, there was virtually no difference among these states in the rate of turnover of the membership. This is House of Representatives only, it doesn't include Senates. And then during that term limit enactment period from 1990 to 2000, during that period of time, the measures start to diverge, and you end up with about, on average, an 18-point differential in the rate of turnover of the members. So very clearly, what you're seeing here is a difference in levels of experience between term-limited states and non-term limited states. This is a little bit different look at it. Here, this is the percentage of members in each chamber who have served at least 5 years in the legislature. And so the top line in green is the non-term limited states. The middle line is the 8-year limits, which, remember I said that's the most common. And then at the bottom is the 6-year term limit states. So this measure is at the time that a term begins. So the striking thing here is in those 6-year limit states, Arkansas and Michigan, they don't have any members unless they came over from the other chamber. They don't have any members with 5 years of experience at the start of their last term. So, and we'll talk about some of the implications of that in a moment. So this slide shows something that political scientists have dubbed the Burkean Shift. For those of you who remember your political science, your political theory, you remember that Edmund Burke was the member of parliament from England who famously drew the distinction between legislators who regarded their responsibility as representing their constituents and reflecting their views versus a delegate role where the members used their own judgment much more than they did their constituents' point of view. So this slide shows, we asked a question in one of our surveys, legislators today compared to a decade ago spend much less time or much more time on each one of these aspects of their job. And this is a scale of 1 from much less time to 5 much more time. So on each one of these measures, sending out mailings, seeking district projects, solving constituent problems, and talking to constituents, the term limited states scored lower than the non-term limited states. So the quick summary here is that while these are not huge differences, they are statistically significant differences that show that legislators in term limited states tend to spend less time serving their constituents, paying attention to their constituents than the ones in term limited states. And there's actually a logical reason for this. One of the claims of the advocates of term limits at the very beginning was that we will get much more competitive elections as a result of term limits. Well, that turns out not to be true at all, because a person who is ambitious for office, who would like to serve in a term-limited states, there's no incentive for them to take on an incumbent. Because they know that all they have to do is wait 4 years, 6 years, and then that seat will be open, and it's a much easier job to win an open seat than it is to contest an incumbent. So contesting of elections has actually gone down under term limits, and I think that's the explanation of this slide about the Burkean shift. So another natural result of the reduced level of experience that I showed in those previous slides. Here's another one where the question was, legislators today compared to a decade ago are much less knowledgeable or much more knowledgeable on a scale from 1 to 5 on committee issues, on legislative process issues, and on statewide policy issues. And again, here the differences are more obvious, also statistically significant, that the legislators in term-limited states are less knowledgeable. So a further extension of experience, kind of a complicated slide here, but this looks at speakers of the House in the years immediately after the implementation of term limits, comparing speakers in the 6 to 8 year limits in the light blue, 12-year limits in brown, that's Louisiana and Oklahoma, and the non-term limited states in the deeper bluish purple. And here you can see I'm sorry, I was talking about a different slide. Excuse me, I was talking about the next slide. So this shows movement from the House to the Senate in each one of those 3 categories. And you see a very significant increase in the states with either 6-year or 8-year limits in the frequency with which members move from the House to the Senate. This is an important slide from the standpoint of that my original point about the type of term limit makes a difference. I should have mentioned to you on that very first slide where we showed Arkansas and Michigan up in the upper right quadrant of 6-year term limits in the House and 8 years in the Senate, and lifetime limits. Well, it used to be up until 6 months ago that California was also in that category, but California in November of, 18 months ago. California in November of 2012 enacted a change in their term limits to go to 12 years regardless of what chamber you have served in. And that had a very significant impact on the incentive structure, or we think it has. It's yet to be seen. In California, it had come to be that 95% of the members of the Senate had previously served in the state assembly, which is what they call their lower house of representatives. And so the Senate over time had gained an advantage over the House. They were the repository of experience and knowledge. And so there was an imbalance in the legislature in California, and they are heavily represented in those high slides there showing movement from the high bars showing that movement from House to Senate. So what's changed in California is the incentive structure for legislators who want to gain influence and power within the legislature. The incentive now is not to move from the House to the Senate as quickly as possible, but rather to serve out some time in one chamber and advance to gain seniority, maybe to become speaker, to become chair of a committee. This one has to do with the description I was giving you without looking at it, the experience of House speakers in term-limited legislatures. And here you're looking at the 6 states that were part of our intensive case studies: Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, and Ohio. And again, pretty much by definition, you impose term limits, you're going to very significantly decrease the experience level of the top leader of the legislature. We would show the same thing with committee chairs. You know, I said earlier that typically legislators don't serve more than 8 or 10 years in the legislature, except that there are always a few who do. And they are the experienced hands, the knowledgeable ones, and they gravitate toward the leadership positions that make a difference in the legislature. So here's another complicated but important slide, and it shows the power shifts over 10-year periods of time in our 6 term-limited states and our 3 non-term limited control states. And so anything below 0 here on this is a gain in power for the executive in relation to the legislature. Anything above 0 is a gain for the legislature. And here you can see that in all but one of the 6 term-limited states, there were significant gains for the governor and state agencies, but I'm going to focus primarily here on the governor in relation to the legislature. The one exception was Ohio, and in some ways it's an exception that proves the rule, in that at the time that we were doing this study, Ohio had a relatively weak governor, and while term limits had mostly taken effect, there were a top leader in the Senate and a top leader in the House who had been very, very effective leaders, and they still had a little bit of time left. And so there was this wide perception that the Ohio legislature had gained power in relation to the governor at the time that we were doing that study. Now look at each of the control states, where during the same period of time in 2 of those states there were small gains for the legislature in relation to the governor, and in one, Kansas, a small decline. So this is one of the key points about our study of the impact of term limits, which is that in relation to the executive branch, the legislature is weakened by the imposition of term limits. Now, some of you maybe are going to ask, well, governors are term limited, and aren't they? And in fact, there are more states with term limits for governors, usually 2 4-year terms, than there are term limits for legislatures. But you have to think about the difference between the division of labor and the source of expertise for governors versus legislatures. Governors stand at the top of a huge pyramid of experts in state government policy. They have thousands of people in their Department of Natural Resources, in their Department of Health and Human Services, in their education departments. And all of those people are feeding the information to the governor. And if you place term limits on the governor, it really affects only one person at the top, or his or her immediate cadre of policy advisors. It doesn't affect all the other sources of information that governors have available to them. With the legislature, on the other hand, it's this very, very flat structure with, you know, in most states between 100 and 250 legislators, each one of whom is equal. And yes, they do have a staff, but it's a very, very small staff in relation to the size of the executive branch. And so what the legislature relies on for expertise is the members themselves. And typically legislatures divide up the labor, and members become experts in specific policy areas. And so it's the people who actually get term limited in the legislature who are the source of its expertise. So I would argue that term limits have a much bigger impact on the legislature than they do on the governor. And I see Governor Edgar here, and maybe he will argue that one way or another later on today. So let me just try to summarize the key findings of our national study. First of all, that term limits vary in their impact based on the type of limit and the type of legislature, that the more professionalized legislatures, the more year-round legislatures have had, like California or Michigan or Florida, or Ohio, have had greater impact. The term limits have had a greater impact on them than they have on the more classic citizen legislatures on our list of term-limited states like Maine or Montana or South Dakota. The loss of experienced legislators has meant less knowledge of substantive issues, less institutional knowledge, and in our study we actually found that they were more chaotic legislatures. They were legislatures that were just difficult for leaders to control, and more difficult to obtain consensus and agreement. One thing I haven't talked about yet is that there was, interestingly, no effect on who gets elected. Again, this was one of the key points of the advocates of term limits. If we have term limits, we'll get more women, we'll get more minorities, and we'll get a younger membership. In fact, that did not occur. There's no difference both before and after term limits in the representation of women and between term-limited and non-term limited states. With minorities, there's also not a significant difference. There was some very significant change in California, Arizona, and Colorado after the imposition of term limits. There was a major increase in Latino representation in the legislature. But that was due to population changes and other political changes more than it was to term limits. Term limits might have slightly accelerated the growth of representation, particularly in California, of Latino legislators, but it was not the major cause of that. We talked about less attention to constituents, that Burkean effect. And we've talked about senates having more experience in relation to houses, not in every state, but in quite a few of the term-limited states. And lastly, that governors have gained significant power in relation to the legislature. So I'm going to come back here and wrap up in a moment, but before I do, I want to cover one other topic that I know is of interest here in Illinois, and that we had a question about a little earlier, and that has to do with limits on leaders' terms. And again, in our best NCSL fashion, we have a lot of comparative information here. And this table shows the states that have limits on leaders' terms, either 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, or 8 years, and whether this is done by custom, by tradition, or whether it is done by rule. And in only one instance, in Maine, in the House and Senate, is it done by statute. So there are 15 chambers that do limit leaders' terms. Most of them, as you can see here, by custom. So let me just conclude by saying that in a lot of ways, from my standpoint, where you come out on term limits depends on your biases to begin with. I am one who believes in a strong and effective legislative branch of government that is an independent and co-equal partner with the executive branch. And so my bias is against term limits, and because they weaken the legislature. But other people don't favor necessarily a strong, independent, co-equal branch of government. I remember when the term limit movement was first starting, I attended a seminar in Washington, D.C. put on by the Cato Institute that was advocating for these term limits. And after the speakers had all made their contributions, there was kind of token opposition to it, mostly people in favor. Somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, but won't term limits weaken the legislature? And the president of the Cato Institute said, that's exactly the point. If you take the viewpoint that you want weak governmental institutions, then term limits certainly have an attraction, and I respect that. Well, having said all that, I guess I'm probably less concerned about term limits than I was back in the 1990s when I took public positions against it, in large part because I knew then and maybe didn't appreciate as much the notion that legislatures are highly adaptive institutions. They know how to roll with the punches of all different kinds, and term limits just happens to be one of those punches, maybe more a deflating one. But they do come back, they adapt, they change. Maybe they're weaker than they were, but they are still worthy institutions that continue on.
You're watching the Illinois Channel.